Welcome to the EQ Video Tip. I'm your host, Eric Forsetter. As always, we're so thrilled to have you back for another terrific episode. Before we get into today's episode, let's jump into the goals of EQ Video Tip. Welcome back. We have a great show today coming to us from Sarah Wilson, who writes an article about how supportive leaders approach emotional conversations. And I'd like to say it's not just for leaders, but anyone approaching an emotional conversation, how to handle it, how to act, and how to talk to someone who's going through a tough time. One of the things that Sarah talks about early on is these are things that we don't want to do. Common scenarios when someone approaches with you with something that's very emotional. We don't want to do dismissive phrasing like, what do you have to be sad about? Or we don't want to minimize it and say everyone feels sad sometimes or everybody feels like that sometimes. Those are things that we want to try to avoid. We also don't want to do negation, which is, hey, it could be worse. Or prescribing solutions like, don't worry about this. Those things don't help out. The last thing is we don't want toxic positivity, which is, hey, just look on the bright side. Those are a lot of things that instinctively we probably want to do, but we have to realize sometimes we need to be empathetic and walk in those shoes. Let's talk about ways that leaders and people or individuals can approach emotional conversations. We'll get into it right after this break. Welcome back. Our first tip, and all of our tips are going to be, what does emotionally supportive language sound like? And that's very important when you're talking to someone. The first thing you want to do is validate the experience. And when we validate someone's experience, we want to simply acknowledge and say, I hear you, that sounds challenging, or it sounds like a rough time, or I can see why that's exhausting. Not only are you saying I see you, but you're also saying I believe you. And it's important to validate someone's emotional situation when you talk to them. So first thing to do, validate their experience. Tip number 2, we want to seek to understand the experience. And when we seek to understand the experience, you want to ask questions like, tell me more, or questions that are going to allow the person to give you more information about what's going on. Not only are you validating them, but now you're trying to be helpful and understand what their emotional awareness is and what it's going through. It will also, by asking these questions, it might help them to determine what exactly they need and what kind of support you can offer them. So take a moment to seek and understand what they're looking for. Tip number 3, guide their emotional and physical support by offering a specific area of support. And when people are in a heightened state of emotion, it's sometimes hard to say, well, what can I do to support you? They don't know what they need. Instead, sometimes ask, would it be helpful if I did X? Or what would Y look to you? Would this help you out in the long run? Offering them a specific way might be easier with a yes-no question. Typically, we don't want to have yes-no questions, but again, people in a heightened state of emotion sometimes need that quick yes-no answer to help them resolve their issues and their conflict within. Tip number 4, invite perspective instead of prescribing a solution. It sounds very easy. We've all gone through similar crises or emotional states that other people have gone through. And it's very simple to say, oh, well, I went through this and this is how it should be done. Instead of saying that, offer them the following. Say, would it be helpful if I told you about how my experience played out and what I did to resolve it? Things like that give them perspective to ultimately think about the challenge that they're facing and then understand if it's worth dealing with it and if your solution offers them something that will make them in a better emotional state. So take a moment to invite perspective as opposed to prescribing the right solution. Our last tip, acknowledge and appreciate them. And it's so important to do this. Saying something like, I can see this has been a hard time for you and I'm here to support you and I appreciate that you trusted me with this information. It signals to both you and to them that the conversation we are having is very important, and it reinforces that sense of safety for future conversations should a need to have one arise. So take a moment to acknowledge and appreciate them, because they're trusting in you and you want to make sure that you've earned that trust back. That concludes this week's EQ video tip. Hopefully you'll find it helpful when you face an emotional friend, colleague, coworker that has some kind of emotional challenge that they're dealing with. Again, it's not easy to go through any of these things, so make sure that you acknowledge that you're there for them, and take a look at these other tips to help you out when someone you care about is going through a difficult time. So that concludes our EQ video tip for today. Try incorporating some of these tips into your daily routine. But remember, use what works best for you and personalize it for yourself. Thank you always to our great research team for providing us with some great tips today. As always on EQ Video Tip, we want to end with gratitude. So thank you for watching. We really appreciate it. Here are some resources that you can use if you want more information on EQ going forward. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thank you.